Amaka wrote the story with care, making sure every detail was accurate and respectful. She wanted people to see Sam not as a scandal, but as a human being with hopes, fears, and dreams. When the article was published, it sparked a wave of reactions. Some people praised Amaka for her bravery in writing about such a controversial topic. Others were angry, accusing her of promoting immorality. But despite the backlash, the article made people think. For the first time, some began to question their own beliefs. The town was divided. Some people, like Auntie Uju, supported Sam and called for compassion. "He's still a child of God," Auntie Uju said during a church meeting. "Who are we to judge him?" But others, like Pastor Bala, became even more vocal in their opposition. "This is exactly what the devil wants," Pastor Bala shouted from the pulpit. "He wants us to accept sin and call it love. We must stand firm." Pastor Bala's fiery sermons attracted a group of followers who began calling themselves the Holy Shield. Their mission was to protect the town's values by any means necessary. They started organizing protests outside Sam's house, carrying signs that read, "Repent or leave," and "Protect our town from sin." Sam tried to ignore them, but their presence made him feel unsafe. David, always calm and supportive, encouraged him to stay strong. "They're just trying to scare you," he said. "Don't let them win." But the protests weren't the only challenge. Sam's father, Preacher Obafemi, was growing angrier by the day. The article had brought even more attention to his family, and he felt humiliated. "How dare she write about us?" he fumed one evening. "She's making a mockery of our name." Mama and Kim, who had read the article, disagreed. "The story wasn't unkind, Obafemi," she said gently. "It showed Sam's pain, but also his strength." Preacher Obafemi shook his head. "Strength? This is not strength, Nkem. It's rebellion, and I will not stand for it." The tension in the town grew until the church elders decided to hold a meeting to address the controversy. The meeting was open to everyone, and the hall was packed with people eager to share their opinions. Pastor Bala spoke first. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice booming, "we are under attack. The enemy is using one of our own to sow confusion and destroy our values. We must act now to save our town." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many people nodded, clapping their hands in support. Then Auntie Uju stood up. She was small and frail, but her voice was strong. "Pastor Bala," she said firmly, "what about love? What about forgiveness? Are these not values too?" The room fell silent. "Sam is still a part of this community," Auntie Uju continued. "He is still a child of God, and he deserves our kindness. Have we forgotten what it means to love our neighbors?" Some people in the audience nodded, but others whispered angrily. "She's too soft," someone muttered. "This is why our morals are falling apart." The debate went on for hours, with no clear resolution. By the end of the night, the town was still deeply divided. Some people left the meeting feeling hopeful, while others left angrier than ever. That evening, Sam sat at home, reflecting on the day's events. He was tired of fighting, tired of being judged, and tired of feeling like he didn't belong. "David," he said quietly, "sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to just leave this town." David put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Sam," he said. "But remember, you're not alone. There are people who care about you." Sam nodded, though his heart still felt heavy. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he couldn't face it alone. The Holy Shield's anger burned hotter after the town meeting. Pastor Bala had stirred them up with talk of protecting the community's values. For them, Sam wasn't just a man living his life. He was a symbol of everything they thought was wrong, and they were determined to force him out of town. Late one night, while Sam and David were having dinner, the first real act of violence happened. A loud crash shattered the peace. They both jumped, startled as a rock came flying through their living room window. Glass scattered everywhere. David ran to the window and looked outside. In the darkness, he could see figures holding torches, their faces shadowed but their voices loud. "Leave our town," someone shouted. "You don't belong here." Another voice chimed in. "You're an abomination. God will judge you." Sam stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had known people were angry, but this was different. This wasn't just words. This was hate, pure and dangerous. David pulled him away from the window. "Stay back," he said firmly. "They're trying to provoke you." "But this is my home," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "Why can't they just let me live my life?" David placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. "Because they're scared," he said. "People attack what they don't understand." Outside, the mob grew louder. They chanted, banged on the door, and threatened to come inside. David grabbed his phone and called the police. "We need help," he said. "There's a group of people outside our house. They're threatening us." The police arrived quickly, and the mob scattered. But the damage was done. The broken window and the hateful words left a deep scar on Sam's heart. Among the Holy Shield was a young man named Eve. He had joined the group because he wanted to fit in, to prove he was strong and righteous. But deep down, Eve carried a secret of his own, one that he was too afraid to admit even to himself. Eve had always felt different. Like Sam, he wasn't drawn to the things people expected of him. But unlike Sam, he buried those feelings deep inside. He told himself it was just a phase, something he could pray away. When Pastor Bala spoke about sin and righteousness, Ife listened intently, hoping to find answers. But when he saw Sam, something stirred inside him, something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was curiosity, maybe even admiration. Sam was living openly, despite the hate and judgment. Eve couldn't imagine being that brave. One day, while walking through the market, Eve saw Sam and David shopping together. They were smiling and laughing, looking carefree despite everything they were facing. Eve's heart ached as he watched them. How can he live like that, he thought. Doesn't he care what people think? That evening, Eve couldn't sleep. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He wanted to hate Sam, but he couldn't. He wanted to feel righteous, but he felt like a fraud. He was trapped between the person he pretended to be and the person he truly was. After the attack on Sam's house, Amaka decided she couldn't just sit back and watch. She knew the Holy Shield wouldn't stop unless someone stood up to them. So she came up with a plan. One evening, she followed the group as they gathered outside Sam's house again. This time, they carried torches and chanted louder than before. Amaka, armed with her camera and notebook, began recording everything. When the group saw her, they froze. "What are you doing here?" Pastor Bala demanded, stepping forward. "I'm documenting the truth," Amaka said boldly. "The world deserves to see what you're doing." Pastor Bala sneered. "This isn't your business, girl. Leave before you get hurt." But Amaka stood her ground. "Touch me, and your face will be on every newspaper in the country," she warned, holding up her camera. The group hesitated. Some of them dropped their torches and began to back away. Others stayed, their anger simmering but their confidence shaken. "You can't scare me," Amaka continued. "I'll keep writing, and people will know the truth. Sam isn't the enemy. Your hate is." One by one, the group dispersed, their voices fading into the night. Pastor Bala glared at Amaka but said nothing. He turned and walked away, his shoulders tense with frustration. Amaka stayed until the street was quiet. Then she knocked on Sam's door. "Are you okay?" she asked when he opened it. Sam nodded, though his face was pale. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Amaka smiled. "You're not alone, Sam. Remember that." Ife watched the events unfold from the shadows. He hadn't joined the group that night, but he had followed them to Sam's house, unsure of what he would do. When he saw Amaka stand up to Pastor Bala, something inside him shifted. For the first time, Ife realized he didn't have to be part of the Holy Shield. He didn't have to hide behind hate and fear. But leaving the group wouldn't be easy. Pastor Bala was like a father to him, and the other members saw him as a loyal soldier. Walking away would mean losing everything he had built. Still, Ife couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He admired Sam, not because he was perfect, but because he was brave. Sam was living the life Ife wished he could live. And maybe, just maybe, Ife could find the courage to live that life too. Preacher Obafemi sat alone in his study, his head resting in his hands. The house was silent, but his thoughts were loud and restless. Sam's confession, the growing scandal, the whispers in the town, it all weighed heavily on him. He had always been a man of faith, but now his faith felt like a burden. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of his congregation, their judgment heavy in their stares. Some had already stopped attending his sermons, murmuring that a preacher who couldn't control his own household had no business leading a church. The thought of losing his congregation, his legacy, and his reputation was unbearable. "What am I supposed to do, Lord?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "How do I fix this?" In the corner of his study sat a box of letters, notes from people in the town, some offering support but most expressing disappointment. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. "A son like Sam is a stain on your name. If you truly want to restore your family's honor, you know what must be done." The words lingered in his mind, planting dangerous ideas. He had already pushed Sam out of the house, but it wasn't enough. As long as Sam remained in the town, the whispers wouldn't stop. The shame wouldn't go away. That night, Preacher Obafemi made a decision that would haunt him forever. He sought out Idowu, a man known for his ability to solve problems discreetly. Idowu was feared and avoided by most, but for the desperate, he was the answer to impossible situations. The meeting between Preacher Obafemi and Idowu took place in a quiet, dimly lit room at the back of a local tavern. Idowu was a tall, imposing man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried the weight of unspoken threats. "You want me to take care of someone?" Idowu said, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Preacher Obafemi nodded, his hands trembling. "It must look like an accident," he said. "I can't afford for this to trace back to me." Idowu smirked. "I don't ask questions, and I don't leave traces," he said. "But my services aren't cheap." Preacher Obafemi hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a thick envelope of cash. "This should cover it," he said. Idowu opened the envelope, counted the money, and nodded. "Consider it done." As Preacher Obafemi left the tavern, a wave of guilt washed over him. He told himself he was doing this to protect his family, his church, and his legacy. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was sacrificing his son to save his pride. That night, Preacher Obafemi had a dream, one so vivid and terrifying that it jolted him awake in a cold sweat. In the dream, he stood in an open field under a dark, stormy sky. The wind howled around him, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it might crumble at any moment. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the heavens. It was deep, powerful, and filled with sorrow. "Obafemi," the voice said, "what have you done?" Before he could respond, the earth split open in front of him, and out crawled a fiery spirit. It had Sam's face, but bore an expression of unimaginable pain. The spirit's voice echoed with anguish as it spoke. "Father," it said, "what father curses the child he brought into this world?" Preacher Obafemi tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, and no words came out. The fiery spirit reached out to him, its eyes burning with both sorrow and anger. "You would rather destroy me than love me," it said, "but your soul will bear the weight of this forever." As the spirit's fiery hands touched him, Preacher Obafemi woke up gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body was drenched in sweat. He sat up in bed, his hands shaking, as he ran them through his hair. "It's just a dream," he whispered to himself. "Nothing more than a dream." But the dream returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time the spirit's voice grew louder, its words cutting deeper into his soul. By the third night, Preacher Obafemi could no longer dismiss it as mere imagination. It felt like a warning, a message from God. Meanwhile, Idowu began tracking Sam. He followed him to the market, to his home, and to the small cafe where Sam and David often met for coffee. Idowu was a professional, cold, calculating, and efficient. He had carried out dozens of similar jobs without hesitation, but something about Sam unsettled him. Sam didn't look like a villain or a troublemaker. He looked like a man simply trying to live his life. Idowu noticed the way Sam smiled at strangers, how he held the door open for others, and how he laughed freely when he was with David. One afternoon, as Idowu sat in his car watching Sam and David through the window of a cafe, he felt an unfamiliar pang of doubt. Sam was laughing, his head thrown back, his face lit with genuine joy. It was a carefree, innocent moment, and it caught Idowu off guard. For the first time in years, the weight of what he was about to do began to bother him. He thought about his own life, the choices he had made, and the people he had hurt. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. That night, Idowu returned to Preacher Obafemi and threw the envelope of cash onto the table. "I can't do it," he said bluntly. Preacher Obafemi's eyes widened. "What do you mean? You've already been paid." "Keep your money," Idowu said, his voice firm. "Your son doesn't deserve this. Whatever shame you're trying to avoid, it's not worth his life." Without another word, Idowu walked out, leaving Preacher Obafemi alone with his guilt. Word of the attempted assassination reached Sam through an anonymous letter. When he read it, his hands trembled, and tears filled his eyes. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew it was true. He knew his father's anger ran deep enough to destroy him. That evening, Sam went to his parents' house. He stood in the living room, facing his father, his voice trembling with emotion. "You would rather see me dead than happy?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. Preacher Obafemi couldn't meet his son's eyes. His shoulders slumped, and he fell to his knees. "Forgive me, my son," he said, his voice breaking. "I was blinded by pride. I thought I was protecting the family, but I was only protecting myself." Mama Ancom, who had been watching from the doorway, rushed to Sam's side and hugged him tightly. "A mother's love cannot be conditional," she said softly. "Sam, come home." But Sam shook his head. "I don't know if I can," he said. "Too much has happened." Though Sam couldn't yet forgive his father, the confrontation marked the beginning of a fragile truce. Preacher Obafemi began to realize that his love for his son was more important than his reputation. But rebuilding their relationship would take time, and time wasn't something they had in abundance. Sam returned to his small house that evening, his heart heavy. He had stood before his father, confronted the man who had once been his hero, and bared his soul. But the wounds between them ran deep, and the scars from the attempted assassination would not heal easily. Though his mother's embrace had given him a glimmer of hope, Sam couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. At home, David was waiting for him. The moment Sam walked through the door, David could see the sadness in his eyes. "What happened?" David asked softly, pulling him into a hug. Sam buried his face in David's shoulder. "He admitted it," he whispered. "He tried to have me killed, my own father." David's arms tightened around him. "I'm so sorry, Sam," he said. "You didn't deserve that." Sam pulled away and sat on the couch, running his hands through his hair. "He apologized," he said. "But how do you forgive something like that? How do you trust someone who was willing to destroy you?" David sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his knee. "You don't have to decide that now," he said. "Take your time. Healing isn't something that happens overnight." While Sam wrestled with his emotions, another battle was taking place within Ife. After watching Amaka stand up to Pastor Bala and seeing Sam's quiet courage, Ife began questioning everything he had believed. The anger he had once felt towards Sam began to dissolve, replaced by admiration and envy. Ife spent hours walking through the quiet streets of the town, lost in thought. He replayed every encounter he'd had with the Holy Shield, every hateful word he'd shouted, and every rock he'd thrown. The guilt was overwhelming. "I've been part of the problem," he thought. "I've been hurting someone who's just trying to live his life." One evening, Ife found himself standing outside Sam's house. His heart raced as he debated whether to knock on the door. Finally, summoning his courage, he raised his hand and tapped lightly. David opened the door, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked. I need to speak to Sam," Eve stammered. "Please, it's important." David hesitated for a moment, then called for Sam. When Sam appeared, his expression turned cold. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I need to tell you something," Aoife said, his voice shaking. "I've been part of the group that's been harassing you. I threw rocks at your house. I shouted hateful things, and I'm so sorry." Sam's eyes narrowed. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've realized I was wrong," Eve said. "You're braver than I'll ever be. You're living your truth, and I've been hiding from mine. I don't want to hurt you anymore. I want to make things right." Sam stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. That night, Eve and Sam talked for hours. Eve confessed his own struggles, his fear of being rejected by his family, and his confusion about his identity. For the first time, he felt understood. "You're not alone," Sam said, "and you don't have to live in fear, but it's going to take time." Eve nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. While Eve began his journey of self-discovery, Pastor Bala was growing more desperate. The Holy Shield's influence was waning, and people in the town were starting to question his motives. Amaka's articles had shed light on their violent tactics, and some of their members had begun leaving the group. "We need to act now," Pastor Bala told the remaining members during a secret meeting. Sam is dividing this town. If we don't stop him, everything we've built will crumble. To continue watching, check out Part 3. Something tragic happened, and you don't want to miss it. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't and click on the notification button for update on new videos.